Filthy animals like you belong in cages, not courthouses. Those words would haunt Officer Martinez for the rest of his life. Judge Kesha Williams approached the courthouse in her civilian clothes, a briefcase containing today's case files. She had no idea what was coming. Martinez blocked her path, sneering down at her with pure contempt. Another ghetto rat trying to sneak in. Before she could respond, his open palm cracked against her face so hard her head snapped sideways. The expensive briefcase flew from her grip, legal documents scattering like confetti across the courthouse steps. Martinez grabbed her by the throat, slamming her back against the stone wall. Filthy animals like you belong in cages, not courthouses. He twisted her arms behind her back, metal handcuffs biting into her wrists. Other officers gathered around, laughing and recording with their phones. Kesha's jaw throbbed, but her eyes stayed locked on the bronze nameplate above the courthouse entrance. The Honorable Judge K. Williams, presiding, 20 feet away from her own courtroom, being brutalized by the very system she served. Have you ever seen instant karma this brutal inside the courthouse? Martinez straightened his uniform and cleared his throat. He had done this dance many times before: spin the story, control the narrative, make himself the hero. The system always believed cops over criminals, especially when those criminals looked like her. Your Honor, Martinez began, his voice steady and practiced. I was conducting routine security protocols when I encountered a suspicious individual attempting to breach courthouse security. He gestured toward Kesha, now sitting in handcuffs at the defendant's table, a purple bruise blooming across her left cheek. The defendant was acting erratically, refusing to provide identification, and became increasingly agitated when asked to comply with standard security procedures. The temporary judge, Judge Harrison, a pale, thin man in his 60s, nodded approvingly. And what exactly did you observe, Officer Martinez? Well, sir, she was dressed inappropriately for court proceedings, carrying what appeared to be stolen legal documents. Martinez's eyes gleamed as he warmed to his fabrication. When I approached to investigate, she became verbally aggressive, using profanity and making threats. From the gallery, two other officers, Rodriguez and Thompson, exchanged knowing looks. They had heard Martinez tell similar stories dozens of times before, different faces, same script. She kept screaming about being someone important, Martinez continued, his voice dripping with disdain. These people always claim to be lawyers, judges, senators, anything to avoid accountability. I've seen this playbook before, Your Honor. Judge Harrison leaned forward, clearly engaged. Did she attempt to flee or resist arrest? Absolutely. The defendant became physically combative when I attempted to place her in protective custody. I was forced to use the minimum necessary force to ensure public safety. Martinez's hand trembled almost imperceptibly as he spoke, the only crack in his polished performance. The court stenographer's fingers flew across her machine, capturing every lie for posterity. In the back row, a young law clerk frowned, something nagging at her memory. Officer Rodriguez, the prosecutor called. Can you corroborate Officer Martinez's testimony? Rodriguez stood, his uniform pressed to perfection. Yes, ma'am. I witnessed the entire incident. The defendant was clearly attempting to circumvent security protocols. Officer Martinez handled the situation with remarkable professionalism. And the alleged assault? Judge Harrison inquired. Martinez's jaw tightened. Your Honor, I used only the force necessary to subdue an aggressive individual who was threatening courthouse security. The defendant's injuries, if any, resulted from her own resistance to lawful commands. He pulled out his phone, swiping to a video that conveniently started mid-confrontation. I have partial footage here, though unfortunately my body cam malfunctioned this morning. The lie rolled off his tongue like honey. How convenient, Kesha murmured, speaking for the first time. I'm sorry, Judge Harrison raised an eyebrow. Nothing, Your Honor, she replied calmly, though her eyes blazed with controlled fury. Martinez continued his performance. What we're seeing here is a classic case of someone playing the victim card after being caught breaking the law. She was trespassing on government property, carrying suspicious documents, and when confronted with her criminal behavior, she immediately claimed discrimination. The prosecutor, a middle-aged woman named Sandra Walsh, nodded sympathetically. Officer Martinez, in your 15 years of service, have you encountered similar situations? Unfortunately, yes. There's a pattern here. Certain individuals believe they're above the law, that rules don't apply to them. They use accusations of racism to deflect from their own criminal behavior. Martinez's voice rose with righteous indignation. It's honestly insulting to the real victims of discrimination. Several people in the gallery, mostly white courthouse employees, nodded in agreement. They had heard similar stories on the news, seen similar narratives play out in social media. It felt familiar, comfortable even. The defendant claims she was going to work. Martinez made air quotes mockingly, but she couldn't provide any employment verification, any identification, or any legitimate reason for being in a restricted area of the courthouse. Thompson, the third officer, stepped forward. If I may add, Your Honor, the defendant was carrying what appeared to be confidential legal documents. We suspect she may have been involved in some kind of identity theft or fraud scheme. Judge Harrison looked intrigued. Fraud scheme? Yes, sir. Martinez jumped back in, sensing momentum. These documents had judicial letterhead, case numbers, and sensitive information. No legitimate citizen would have access to materials like this. We believe she may have been planning to impersonate court personnel. The irony was so thick it was almost suffocating. But Martinez pressed on, oblivious to the trap he was setting for himself. In my professional opinion, he concluded, this is simply another case of someone trying to game the system. She knows if she can make this about race, about alleged police brutality, she can distract from her actual crimes. It's a calculated manipulation of public sympathy. He turned to face Kesha directly, his eyes cold and contemptuous. These people think they can just waltz into any building, any courtroom, any space they choose. And when they're stopped, they scream discrimination. Well, not in my courthouse. The words hung in the air like a poisonous cloud. Several court staff members shifted uncomfortably while others remained stone-faced. Your Honor, Prosecutor Walsh added, the state recommends we proceed with charges of trespassing, resisting arrest, and assault on a police officer. The defendant's attempt to frame this as a civil rights issue is clearly a desperate defense strategy. Martinez allowed himself a small smile. This was going exactly as planned. Another case, another win, another reminder that the system worked the way it was supposed to. People knew their place, or they learned it the hard way. The defendant may now present her statement, Judge Harrison announced, his tone suggesting this would be a mere formality before sentencing. Kesha Williams rose slowly from her chair, the handcuffs clinking softly as she moved. Despite the purple bruise on her cheek and the disheveled state of her clothes, she carried herself with an unmistakable dignity that made several people in the courtroom shift uncomfortably. Thank you, Your Honor. Her voice was clear, controlled, and carried an authority that seemed to fill the entire room. I appreciate the opportunity to address these allegations. Judge Harrison blinked. Something in her tone was unexpected, professional, in a way that didn't match the narrative he'd been presented. First, I want to clarify several factual inaccuracies in Officer Martinez's testimony. Kesha's eyes swept the courtroom methodically, landing on each person who had supported the officer's lies. According to his statement, I was trespassing on government property. However, I was walking on a public sidewalk approaching the main entrance of this courthouse at approximately 8:47 a.m. She turned slightly, addressing Judge Harrison directly. Your Honor, I'm sure you're familiar with the Supreme Court ruling in HGV's Committee for Industrial Organization, which clearly establishes that public sidewalks adjacent to government buildings are traditional public forums where citizens have a constitutional right to be present. The stenographer's fingers paused mid-stroke. The prosecutor frowned. This wasn't the rambling emotional outburst they'd expected from someone facing serious charges. Furthermore, Kesha continued, Officer Martinez testified that I was carrying suspicious documents and suggested I was involved in identity theft. I'd like to examine that claim more closely. She gestured toward the evidence table where her scattered papers had been collected. Those documents are indeed authentic legal materials. Specifically, they include pending case files, judicial memoranda, and administrative correspondence, all of which I have legitimate access to in my professional capacity. Professional capacity? Judge Harrison interrupted. And what exactly is your profession, miss? Kesha paused, a slight smile playing at the corners of her mouth. Williams. Dr. Williams. And I think we'll get to my professional background shortly, Your Honor. Martinez felt a chill run down his spine. Something was very wrong with this picture. Your Honor, if I may continue, Kesha said, her voice taking on the cadence of someone completely comfortable in a courtroom setting. Officer Martinez also testified that I became verbally aggressive and used profanity. I'd like to address that claim by invoking my Fifth Amendment right to remain silent regarding any statements I may have made during the alleged incident. She paused, letting that sink in. However, I will note that any statements I did make were in direct response to being physically assaulted without provocation, warning, or legal justification. The young law clerk in the back row sat up straighter. Something about this woman's voice, her mannerisms seemed familiar. Now, regarding the officer's claim that his body cam malfunctioned, Kesha continued, and now there was steel in her voice. Your Honor, I'm sure you're aware of the federal rules of evidence, particularly Rule 106, which allows for the introduction of summaries of voluminous records. I have reason to believe that comprehensive video and audio evidence of this morning's incident exists and will be made available to this court. Judge Harrison leaned forward. What kind of evidence are you referring to? Your Honor, this courthouse has extensive security camera coverage, including high-definition cameras positioned at 15-foot intervals along the main approach. Additionally, the county maintains automatic backup systems for all officer body cam footage, regardless of claimed equipment malfunctions. The color drained from Martinez's face. He had forgotten about the courthouse security cameras in his rush to control the narrative. I would like to formally request, Kesha continued, that this court issue a preservation order for all electronic surveillance data from this morning between 8:45 and 9:15 a.m., including but not limited to courthouse security footage, body cam backup files, and any mobile phone recordings that may have been made by officers present at the scene. Prosecutor Walsh stood abruptly. Objection, Your Honor. The defendant cannot simply make evidentiary demands without proper legal representation. Kesha turned to face the prosecutor with a look that made the woman take an involuntary step backward. Your Honor, pro se defendants have the constitutional right to present evidence in their own defense under the Sixth Amendment. Additionally, Brady v. Maryland establishes the prosecution's obligation to preserve potentially exculpatory evidence. The silence in the courtroom was deafening. This was not how these cases usually went. Judge Harrison cleared his throat. Miss Williams, you seem unusually familiar with legal procedure. Do you have formal legal training? I have some experience with the judicial system, Your Honor. Kesha's response was carefully neutral, but her eyes gleamed with something that looked almost like amusement. Kesha continued addressing Martinez's behavior directly. You were assaulting a federal judge, and now it's time to show you what real justice looks like.